There are certain sounds every Duluthian knows, like the captain's salute, a long and two shorts. And then the answer from the aerial bridge. That was the American Century arriving Duluth, 1,000 feet long. Carries about 80,000 tons of cargo. That's pretty close to the weight of 2 Titanics, if you could figure out how to get those Titanics on board, that is. Guess you might have to grind them all up and make them into iron ore pellets or something. That's what the American Century carries, mostly. Duluth is a port city, and the sights and sounds of the ships coming and going are just another way you're connected to that lake, Lake Superior. It's in your heart. It's in your soul. But when it comes to what happens exactly on board those ships, beyond the Breakwall, where we've all stood and watched them, well, most folks don't actually know a whole lot about it. Not firsthand. Now, that is where my own experience as a Duluthian is a little different. My dad worked on those ships, the Lakers, the domestic cargo carriers, most of his adult life. He worked his way up to chief engineer, and as a family member and the chief's son, I had the incredible privilege of sailing with him. I very much grew up on those freshwater seas, the Great Lakes. I got to do and see some amazing things as a kid out there, and I met some wonderful, unforgettable people, including one in particular who made such an impression on me. He was a junior member of Dad's crew, a guy named Alan Erickson. As a kid of about 9 years old, I became like Al's pint-sized shadow, no doubt plenty annoying at times, following him around on his watch all over that boat. He became like a big brother to me, and also got to be a lasting friend of my family. So, I decided to try and track Alan down after all these years, and I found him. So, along with some recollections of all the shipboard sights and sounds, people, and adventures I got to experience, I'm going to share some moments from this little reunion with Alan Erickson. You're there.
I'm still here, yeah.
Wow, this is great, Al. Man, do you remember exactly when we would have first crossed paths?
I think it was 1959, the first year, and you made a trip that year, I thought.
I probably did. I made a trip just about every year, so I'd have been about 9 years old.
Yeah. That's right, because I was 19 and that's when I knew I was 10 years older than you, and I was still the youngest by 10 years of people in the engine room.
You know, it was a charmed life for me, and it was great being the chief's kid, but I can't imagine that was a big pleasure for the rest of the crew to have to put up with me.
It just, you weren't a problem because I always got stuck with you.
There's a lot more to the story. So pack your sea bags. We've got a boat to catch.
Let me tell you about my hometown, greatest in the Gopher State. I'll have to brag a little bit, but I really won't exaggerate. Big D-U-L-U-T-H, Duluth, Duluth. That's my hometown, Duluth, Duluth. That's my hometown.
We didn't have cell phones in the 1950s and 60s. If you wanted to reach somebody, you had to catch 'em at home. And no caller ID either. You just had to answer. Hello? I'm Dandy. You? Uh-huh. You know, I'm just in the middle of something. I'm doing a recording. Mm-hmm. It's a podcast.
Podcast?
That's like a radio show. Yeah.
Radio show.
It's about Duluth. Well, I'm hoping a lot of people care. We'll see. We'll see. But I have to excuse myself, okay? Yes, I have sugar. You're welcome. Yes, to borrow a cup. No, you're welcome. But I'm going to have to call you back.
Huge snow.
Sure. Yeah, there's a snow shovel by the front door. Just take it. You betcha.
Okay.
I'll call you back. Mm-hmm. Bye-bye now. Bye-bye. Okay, so what's with the telephone bit, right? I can't hold a candle to Bob Newhart. I guess I'm aging myself with that reference. But that's how a trip down the Great Lakes would always begin. No, not with my neighbor, but with a phone call. But no cell phones, and it was really expensive for Dad to make a ship-to-shore call from the boat. You had to have a marine operator run a patch and all that. So instead, Mom would call a shipping agent to track the whereabouts of Dad's boat and find out when and at what dock he was booked to arrive. Shipping's a schedule-intensive thing. You got to have a dock and a cargo ready to load, or a crew ready to unload whatever's on board already. Most of the time, Dad's boat hauled iron ore, but sometimes grain or coal. For ore, that meant either the DM&IR docks in West Duluth, or else over at the Great Northern docks south of Superior. My grandfather actually hauled a lot of the timber to build those docks down in Eloise, and they were the largest ore docks in the world. They could load 16 ships at a time back in the day. Grandpa hauled that timber with a team of horses over 100 years ago. But today, the docks are mostly dismantled and abandoned. So, Mom might find out about an arrival from the shipping agent, maybe 24 hours ahead. It would be like, west to dock 2, 1 a.m. It never seemed to be at a convenient time. And they didn't care if it was raining, sleeting, blowing, or snowing. That's the time. And back then, it took just about 4 hours to get a load of ore. And when they pulled up that last chute out of the hold, that was it. You better be aboard because the boat didn't wait. So most of the time, that's all there was for Mom and Dad to be together. That 4 hours or so every week or 10 days when the boat was in. But then there were the trips, as we called them, where we'd get on board and go off with Dad down the lakes. Now that was some major happy time, believe me. I had a brother and 2 sisters, but they were several years older, teenagers when I was still in grade school, so they had other interests. But for me, these boat trips were a really big deal. It often meant I got to get out of bed in the middle of the night. These are among my very earliest memories because I actually went for my first trips before I can even remember, when I was still a baby in my mother's arms. We'd usually end up having to wait in the dark at the main gate. The guard wouldn't let us in until the boat was all tied up at the dock, and then the trudge would begin. To my little legs, it felt like the Baton Death March or something, seemingly endless. Gloomy catwalks with old rusty light fixtures dangling and swinging far overhead in the breeze. You walked from one pool of light to the next, far in the distance. Then, as you approach the boat, an all-out assault on your senses. Iron ore sliding down steel chutes from rail cars several stories above into the holds of the ship below. The docks were like big railroad trestles, and the cars with the iron ore would go out on there, and they'd open them up in the bottom and then drop down to the next level into what they called pockets, and then they would let us shoot down into the hold of the ship. You had to holler to make yourself heard. It was such a racket. And then the fumes from the smokestack on the boat, these sulfuric coal fire fumes wafting onto the dock in thick clouds that stung your nose and throat. You could taste it. To my little eyes, the ships always appeared impossibly gargantuan, the decks towering high above the dock. Then my dad would appear out of the smoke near the top of the ladder. Clem Hayden, chief engineer. He'd climb down the ladder and have a couple of the crew lower a rope so he could tie our bags onto it. They'd hoist them up and take them to his quarters. This is about when Clem, my dad, would turn and put one arm around Margaret, my mother, there on the dock, in the dark, with all those fumes swirling around us and the deafening noise and men shouting in the distance, and he'd give her just a little peck on the lips, with little Jimmy standing right there and all. I'd look away, but it made me happy. A kid is always glad, I think, when his folks show how they care for one another. It makes the whole world feel safer. Then we'd all trudge back again to the parking lot, an interminable hike again, off to the family car for a quick trip back home. There his newspapers and mail would be waiting in a pile, and his chair. But he rarely sat. Dad liked to stand, usually in the kitchen, as though he was on watch in an engine room. The air would be blue in the house when he was home because he smoked at least 2 packs of those little unfiltered cigars every day, and we all thought nothing of it. When I was a toddler, I would hug Dad's legs and stand on top of his shoes as he made his way around the kitchen, nibbling a piece of toast and swigging buttermilk. He said that helped quell his ulcer. Pretty soon, Dad would start looking at his watch. Finally, he'd turn to Mom and say, "Well?" And off we went with a couple last pieces of luggage for the interminable hike back down those docks again. Now, we all had to climb that big aluminum ladder, one at a time, except until I was old enough, Dad was always right behind me, his hand gripping the back of my belt, should I lose my footing. It was understood if you fell off that ladder onto the steel and concrete far below, you would certainly be dead. Life on board ship at the dock was a cacophony of comings and goings. For the off-watch, it was a fleeting chance to see girlfriends or wives, if they were lucky enough to have one living there. If not, it was a crewman's chance to hit one of the waterfront bars and knock back a few. Not more than a few, though, if you wanted to keep your job. Drinking was officially prohibited on board, but there are always guys with a few warm beers in the bottom of their lockers to sip on the down low when they were off watch. While we were loading, the grocery boat would come alongside and tie off near the stern. A crane with an electric winch and a big steel basket was swung out by the galley, and all the provisions for the trip would be brought aboard. Now, one highlight for me was something called the bumboat. It was a steel launch, mostly enclosed, that served as a floating convenience store. They tied up to the ship on the side opposite the dock. You accessed it by climbing down a ladder dangling from the side of the ship. The bumboat's aisles were crammed with everything you can think of that you might need if you were, sailing. Candy, cigarettes, nuts, newspapers, toothpaste, boots, and you might find a size that was close, even if not right on the button. And then there was this other section that I was forbidden to browse under Dad's vigilant gaze. The magazines, I believe they were toward the back. A glimpse in that direction suggested to me that some of the publications, let's just say they were aimed at a more mature male readership. Bumboats came along, I suppose, maybe in the 1930s or so, maybe earlier, but they went away decades ago. No more bumboats. By now, the sun would just be coming up, and all the racket of loading would die down. The bumboat would disappear. The guy who came aboard to fix the radar would be leaving. The deckhands, you look over, and now they're standing on the dock in their life jackets, ready to cast off those big steel mooring cables. Then you would notice, we're moving. I would stay on deck, watch us blow for the aerial bridge. Back then, there wasn't all this gratuitous horn honking around Canal Park. None of this captain's salute business. Which, by the way, little trivia, that long and two shorts, it's Morse code for the letter D. What does that stand for, I wonder? But they're just doing the big salute thing for the benefit of the tourists nowadays. Back before two-way radios came along, a ship's whistle was for communication. It might be the only way. Among other things, it was how you let a bridge know you wanted it to open for you. You sounded its unique horn signal. The aerial bridge was actually a long, a short, a long, and a short. And, as you can imagine, ships would have to blow for a bridge long before they got there. Wouldn't do a whole lot of good to wait until you're in between the piers. Bridge needs to be open by then. By the time Duluth slid away into the distance, it was very quiet on board. I could feel the vibration of the engine powering up, and then the ever-present breeze that you have cutting through the air at 17 or 18 miles an hour. Out there, the wind is always off the lake, and soon enough, all you can see is lake. A good time to unpack and get out that heavy jacket. When I was little, Dad kept a really close eye on me. I was really never out of Mom or Dad's sight. But as I got older, I pretty much had the run of the ship. In fact, if we didn't have any passengers, and yes, we sometimes did carry passengers, but if not, I could get a room all to myself up forward in the passengers' quarters. Lots of beautiful antique oak paneling, brass, tile. Bear in mind, the whole ship was an antique by this time. Dad always sailed on one of two boats, the Colonel James M. Schoonmaker or the William P. Snyder Jr. Those were the names of two of the three ships in that small fleet owned by the Chenango Furnace Company. They were launched the same year, 1912, and at the time, they were the biggest ships ever built exclusively for carrying bulk cargo. They were a bit over 600 feet long. Now, that gave them a fraction of the cargo carrying capacity of our modern-day 1,000-footers. But they were built to last. I got the chance to talk about those boats with Alan Erickson, that member of Dad's crew that I introduced earlier. Talk a little bit about the Chenango Fleet. Was it something special? Were those boats better than some others?
Absolutely. They were built stronger. They all had reinforced bows. They could go through ice that only a Coast Guard cutter could go through, an icebreaker.
And what about life on board? I remember sitting in the dining room with my dad eating off of china that had the company insignia in it.
Well, that's because you ate at the officers' table. I ate in his crew's mess.
Mm-hmm. But it was the same food, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, passengers had, when we carried passengers, they had their own cook, and they got special food if they wanted it. Most of the time, the food that we had was so damn good, and I didn't grow up with money at all, and I wasn't used to eating that well.
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself was a big deal.
Now, those passengers, they weren't paying members of the general public. By the time I came along, the passengers were all guests of the company, and the William P. Snyder Jr. would often be carrying members of the family. William P. Snyder Sr. was the guy who started Snyder Mining when he was just in his 20s, back in the late 1800s. He'd gotten a job in the iron business back home in Pennsylvania, but then Snyder got wind that there was iron ore, lots of it, in northern Minnesota, and decided he wanted a piece of the action. Within a matter of several years, Snyder owned mines on Minnesota's Iron Range, steel plants back in Pennsylvania, and the ships to haul the ore in between.
On a Chenango boat, they were a small company owned by the Snyder family in Pittsburgh. And the crew and everybody on the boat was treated like family when Mrs. Snyder and her sister would make a trip. They made a trip each year. And they were just, rich people, but they just didn't have any come-ons to them. They were just straight.
Mm-hmm.
And they treated their crew like family.
Family was an operant word in the Chenango Fleet. The company believed strongly in keeping families together, even if husbands and fathers were going to be away most of the time. That's why I got to make all those trips with my folks, my formerly related folks, including not just Mom and Dad, but my two sisters and a brother. And then there's all the other people we got to meet and become friends with out on those boats.
We were just one big family. If you didn't get along, your dad didn't tolerate it. He'd get rid of somebody. Put you on another boat or send you ashore.
I actually got to find out from Alan a lot of things I might never have known about Dad, from the point of view of the people who worked for him.
Your dad, I enjoyed learning from him. He was a good teacher and a good mentor. And he would get me books if I couldn't answer a question. Right next thing you know, he'd have a book sitting on my desk in my room. He says, because he said, you're curious, you ask the right questions, and you want to learn, and you want to be an engineer, and that's what we're going to do.
At 19 years old, Alan was just on the starting rung in the engine room. He was a coal passer to begin with, responsible for the fuel that feeds the boiler. And yes, the Snyder Jr. ran on coal at the time. On the next rung up was the fireman, who tends the boilers and makes sure there's steam. Next, you can become an oiler, which means you oversee the operation of all the machinery involved in propulsion. Above that, you become an engineer, an officer, a third engineer to start, then a second, then the first engineer, and finally, if you make the grade and seniority allows, the chief, the honcho. Each step takes a minimum amount of sea time, rigorous study, formal testing, licensing, and seniority. But, as with any job, above all, it takes the approval, the confidence, and the care of a boss.
Clem was so loyal to his troops. If you were sick, he'd just say, we'll have somebody stand your watch.
Mm-hmm.
He just, if you were working for him and you were a good worker, and he would tell you, you're going to make mistakes. Just don't lie to me about them. That's the one thing. He said, I've got to put this down on paper because of the Coast Guard and the company. He said, you leave me hanging. He said, I'll hang you with me. Just tell the truth, even if it hurts.
It takes about 24 hours to get across Lake Superior. 24 chilly, often blustery hours. That's when you made it to Whitefish Bay and the Sioux Locks, Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. They built the first lock over there in 1855 to overcome a little problem. There's a 21-foot drop from Lake Superior to Lake Huron and the other Great Lakes beyond. The locks work just on gravity, opening and closing valves to let water in and out, depending on whether you're downbound or up. The Sioux has the busiest locks in the whole world, based on the tonnage of cargo going through. In an average season, they'll handle anywhere from about 7,000 to 10,000 ships. It takes about 9 hours, all told, to make it from Lake Superior to Lake Huron. That includes winding slowly through the St. Mary's River south of the locks. That's where the weather changes. This is where you put your winter jacket away in midsummer and marvel at how warm the rest of the world is when you get away from Lake Superior. I found the workings of those ships endlessly fascinating. The crews changing shifts at all hours. They worked either 8 to 12, 12 to 4, or 4 to 8. 4 hours on watch and 8 hours off around the clock. I thought it was so cool that I could get a delicious hamburger at midnight in the crew's mess. The night cook was there whenever the shifts changed. And Dad liked rubbing elbows with the crew, even though he was an officer. A funny thing about Dad, he had one finger that was just a stub. Half of it got chewed up in some machinery when he was younger, so they had to amputate. He had a little comedy thing he liked to pull, when he had the right audience.
You'd be sitting at the table with your mother in there, because she'd eat in the crew's mess too. Your dad didn't sit on his position like necessarily. He'd eat in the crew's mess, but they'd both be sitting there having a coffee or something. And he'd go pick his nose and says, God, my finger got stuck. Oh my God, I lost it. Because he'd had somebody that didn't realize didn't have part of that finger. And we all just waited for that joke all the time because we would just be rolling on the floor. He had a pretty snarky sense of humor.
Yeah, he did.
And your mother put up with it, and she had a sense of humor too.
One of the things that always blew me away was all the characters out there on those boats. One of Dad's all-time best friends was the captain, Pete Fichette. And by the way, on the Great Lakes, the captain and chief engineer are actually of about equal rank, similar pay grades, although the navigation and overall conduct of the ship did fall pretty squarely on the shoulders of the captain. And in the case of Pete, those shoulders were not of great stature, not physically anyway. He was actually about the closest thing I've ever seen to a real living Popeye. Except he didn't smoke a pipe.
Oh, my God. The biggest thing about Pete Fichette is he wanted to come down and have coffee with your dad in the galley. And he'd be walking down the deck, and now we're out there in Lake Superior. We got 20-foot waves crashing across the deck, 40-mile-an-hour wind, and he's rolling a damn cigarette.
I remember him having that hanging off of his lip. It wouldn't even be lit, but he would be talking, and it would just be dangling on the edge of his lip.
I'm not sure he ever lit one. I think he'd always had one hanging from his lip, but to watch him roll us with one hand, no less.
Yeah.
The other hand, he's hanging onto the side rails so he doesn't get washed overboard. But he was only about 5'5".
Yeah.
He was a little guy.
But he could be a tough guy, I think, too, couldn't he?
Oh, God, yeah. Boy, if he got mad at somebody, you could hear him in the engine room if he was up front.
And he had quite a vocabulary, didn't he?
It was colorful.
Over the years, I got to do just about everything there is to do on a big ship. I got to blow the whistle. And don't undervalue the life experience of that as a kid, all of 10 or 12 years old, getting to pull just a small lever in the pilot house and do this. I got to play with the radar. Fascinating. They had 2 radars. Everything on the ship was double redundant, so no problem if I might break something. They even let me steer several times when we were way out in the middle of the lake where there was nothing to hit. Yeah, being a kid steering a 600-foot freighter. I explored every inch of that ship. From the huge anchor winch, the windlass in the bow that pulls up chain with links bigger than my head, all the way back to the massive propeller shaft whirling deep down in the bilge, under the engine room.
Go ahead.
Ah, the engine room. The incredibly noisy place to which my dad ended up sacrificing his hearing, I guess. You can't communicate down there except by putting your mouth within about a foot of someone else's ears and shouting. The engine room takes up about 4 or 5 deck levels. On this boat, it's where the boilers made steam, the steam that drove the electric generators to power the whole ship. And it was that steam that ran the engine, turned the rudder, when the wheelsman, 600 feet away in the pilot house, turned the wheel. And then steam pipes also ran from those boilers to the deck engines, the giant winches that reeled the steel mooring cables in and out, and even that anchor windlass. So steam pipes ran all the way forward, 600 feet, so they could lower and raise the anchor. And then there's the engine itself that pushed the ship. They'd replaced the original 1912 engine in 1952 with one of the 2 engines that had powered a vintage aircraft carrier. 6,000 horsepower. My dad supervised the installation on the Snyder Jr. himself. It was a Skinner Uniflow, 5 gigantic steam-driven pistons.
And it was a fast engine. You were immediately at 100% power as soon as you swung the levers to open it up, it would lift the screw right out of the water.
Huh.
You had to learn how to quick oil it too, because it's running 120 revolutions, and you just had to, if you did it wrong, the piston to hit your oil can and smash it all to heck.
Wow.
But it usually only happened about once, and you learn because you didn't want your finger and your arm going with it too.
The possibilities for losing a digit, a limb, or losing your life entirely are practically endless. So, just being in the engine room, even as a spectator, came with the responsibility of knowing all the dangers.
You knew how to act on a ship, and as young as you were, you asked pretty good questions because you had probably more experience than I did the first year anyway.
I loved hanging around, I'll say that.
Well, it beat the heck out of being with mom and dad all the time. And you were around it, and your mother was not uninterested in what her husband did. So she hung around the engine room. She'd come down there, and she knew to ask questions. She knew what a damn turbine was, and she knew what a piston-driven uniflow was. And you weren't a problem because your dad would flat tell you listen to Al.
Yes.
If he tells me that you're not listening or you're screwing around or something, that's the end of it.
The lower lakes aren't like Lake Superior. The water is warmer and usually has kind of a greenish cast, unlike the cold blue of the big lake. But they can be just as dangerous. The wildest weather I ever saw was actually on Lake Huron, from a storm that came up out of nowhere one sunny afternoon, and by dark had waves crashing across the decks. The portholes in my dad's office, 4 stories above the waterline, would sometimes be partially submerged. We rolled so bad, Dad would sometimes be standing with 1 foot on the wall. And Mom? Well, she spent the night in Dad's bathroom, bracing herself against a porcelain fixture.
I was in one that was particularly bad. It turned the schoonermaker around. And then we had to turn it around again. We were downbound to Cleveland, and we hit a rogue wave, and it turned us around. And we did a heck of a list that we thought was going to roll us over.
Yeah.
And that was the scariest one, but it was so quick. You didn't even have time to get scared. You don't have time to be afraid so much because you just say, never mind the life jacket, because if it goes down, I'm going to go with it. You're not going to get out of there. The water's too cold.
When it comes to storms, it's hard not to think about the Edmund Fitzgerald, the 729-foot freighter that went down in November of 1975. Suddenly and rather mysteriously, in hurricane-force conditions on Lake Superior, just north of Whitefish Bay.
When you come around the corner heading for the Sioux at Whitefish Bay, that's where the worst damn weather occurred in any storm. You get hit, the wind is going one way, the waves are going another. And you're in for a ride.
What do you think happened?
No idea. You can dive. The thing but is she was loaded, so she was heavy. And she may have just torpedoed into a rogue wave that nobody could have expected. It just kept going down. Just went in and went down. It would have been so quick they wouldn't have even had time to think about trying to go out and get on deck because they were already underwater anyway.
Yeah.
So, no, it would just happen so quick. I doubt that you'd even have time to say goodbye.
The runs I made were usually about 6 to 10 days round trip, and the destination was pretty much always a steel plant. Could be Cleveland, or Buffalo, New York, or Ashtabula, Ohio, where Alan is from. These docks were right out of Dante's Inferno. loud, hot, ridden with noxious fumes belching from blast furnaces that lit the sky up red at night. The boat usually sat at the dock for close to 24 hours as these big clamshell cranes went down into the hold and scooped the iron ore up and over into rail cars, and then they went right straight into the steel plants. There were times I wondered, what makes someone want to have this as their full-time life? Sailing. Often noisy, always dangerous, and what about the loneliness of it? You're out there all alone. Did you feel lonely?
No, it was too exciting. We were on a ship at sea, which, don't forget, I was born in Ashtabula. And my grandparents owned a bar right next to the lake. And my one uncle was a commercial fisherman. I was born in Ashtabula Harbor, so I was always around the water. It was the realization of my lifelong dream to be a sailor.
What was your favorite thing about it?
Just about I was naturally curious. It was just, it came at the right time of my life. And I still think I'm a sailor. I think about it every single day.
But tragically, Alan's lifelong dream didn't lead to the lifelong career he'd imagined. Like I was saying, ships are intrinsically dangerous things, and everything changed for Alan one dark night in Buffalo, New York, when he and one of his best shipboard buddies, the second assistant engineer, were returning from a quick break ashore.
Archie McClellan.
Oh, I remember the name.
We were out and had a couple drinks and weren't drunk. And since I was 22 and he was 42, I was always the youngest kid. And he would park in Buffalo with the headlights on so I could see my way to the ladder on the boat. Next morning, I went to wake him up because he hadn't come down the engine room yet. We were in layup dock on the lakefront, and he wasn't there.
Oh.
My best friend fell off the boat and drowned.
Oh, no.
And your dad did everything he could, but I wanted to go home. I said, no way, I can't. I said, I sailed with him. He'd been with Clem and I for 4 years.
Oh.
We'd all been together. And he must have slipped and fallen off the ladder or something. We had one of those safety ladders with the extra handrails. So I don't know what happened. If he tripped, we were not drunk.
Mm-hmm.
Your dad told Margaret, said, he's not going to come back. He said, he's too young. He can't take this. I was going through depression and I was in tough shape.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just, I mean, when you're with a guy 24/7, it's, the whole crew is together and this here, plus they questioned me unendingly in Buffalo, the Buffalo police, making sure that we didn't have a fight or something. Hell, I said, we never even had an argument.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, and finally your dad called the company and they sent a lawyer up and they ordered him off the boat. So he said, either you come up with something different, but no more harassment. He said, he's a young kid. And your dad was hot. Boy, he was pissed.
Mm-hmm. Because they were trying to almost accusing you?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They were, and I hadn't even had time to feel my way through the problem yet. It was still right out there on my arm.
At commemorative ceremonies for the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, they sometimes ring the 200-pound bronze bell recovered from the wreck, as the name is read of each member of the crew who lost his life there. But there are so many more, so many Archie McClellans. I knew Archie. His cabin was a couple doors down from Dad's. I also knew Johnny Mansica, the mate who leaned over an open hatch when we were loading and fell 4 stories down to the steel cargo deck below. I knew Gene Wiseman, the engineer who went forward one day to tighten the fitting on a steam pipe. It was hissing from a leak. Gene turned the wrench, and the whole pipe ruptured. Gene left us, trapped in a compartment that was instantly flooded with a searing cloud of 750-degree steam. I could go on and on. So, Alan quit the sailing life. He retired from the lakes after just 4 years out there, and as he was rising rapidly in the ranks, still in his early 20s, he joined the Air Force and went on to a successful, prosperous career ashore. But the family kept in touch with Alan for decades.
I loved your folks to death. They were my absent parents. And I got to see your folks at least once a year because I loved going to Duluth. And your mother, and when she would come here, Bonnie had her flower shop. Bonnie would make her some flowers and stuff like that, and your mother just ate that up.
Yeah.
But we all got along just great.
Dad retired from the lakes in 1969 when the Chenango Fleet was sold. He didn't want to work for some other company. He lived to be 88, by the way, despite all those little cigars he liked to smoke and all those steamboat donuts fried in lard. Mom made it to 98. As for the William P. Snyder Jr., she hauled cement for a while on the lower lakes, got converted from burning coal to oil, and was finally sold for scrap in 1986. But the other boat my dad and I sailed, the Colonel James M. Schoonmaker, is now a floating museum. You can tour the whole ship, all freshly painted in her original green hull with the orange waterline. She's docked for life at the National Museum of the Great Lakes in Toledo, Ohio. As for Duluth, it's a place Alan Erickson will never forget.
Duluth is my favorite city. It was the first city I went to on my first trip. And I thought, boy, I'd like to live up here. I can come down to this bridge here and sit here and watch the boats go in and out. Plus, I thought they had the prettiest girls in Duluth of anywhere I'd ever been. You know, I would have asked your sister out for a date if I had been so afraid of your old man.
I think she'd have gone.
Duluth, Duluth, that's my hometown. Duluth, Duluth, that's my hometown.
My Duluthian Life with Jim Hayden is produced monthly by Planet Pictures Media. You can listen wherever you get your podcasts.